Hey, what's going on, people? How you doing? I go by the name AKA Subliminal. My real name is Mauricette, and this is my 5th year architectural thesis project right here at the University of Toronto. A lot of people know me for beatboxing, a lot of people know me for DJing, rhyming, production, acting, comedy. But what a lot of people don't know is that I actually have a degree in architecture from the University of Toronto. This is my project. It's called soundSPACE. It's all based on what you hear rather than what you see. Before I get into the project, I think I should give you a little background on who I am and sort of what got me interested in architecture in the first place. Ever since I was little, like 4 years old, I first started building little bridges and little towers with little cars. And my mother was always impressed how they didn't fall over. I was able to make these things stand up from such a young age. When I got into elementary school, I loved building model airplanes. I started building balsa wood airplanes and little NASCARs and different things like that. When I got into high school, I took every drafting course that I could. As a teacher told me that if you want to get into building, you should really try and be an architect. So I took every drafting course that I could. I remember designing this one house, and I remember in the middle of the class, my teacher said, "Sean Mauricette, can I see you outside, please?" And when your teacher asks to see you outside, that cannot be a good thing. So we went outside the class, and he was like, "Did you design this house?" And I was like, "Yes, I did." And he said, "This house is at a second-year university level, and if you do not pursue architecture, it would be a shame." From that point on, I always had that encouragement that I needed to do the architecture and follow it all the way through up into university. Around the same time that I started getting into the architecture more deeply with regard to the drafting classes, I started getting into DJing. My friends, they started to get into trouble, so in an effort to distance myself from them, I began to pick up my father's turntables, just because I was bored on a Friday night and didn't really have too much to do. So I started scratching records. Next thing you know, I'm beatboxing at shows, and for those who don't know what beatboxing is, right? Little echo. Little sample of the beatboxing is. So I started doing all these things, and I continued it. Now it's time to get into university. I decided to apply to the University of Toronto's architectural program. I didn't think I'd get in because they were only picking 54 students out of like 850 internationally. And I'm thinking, what chance do I really have? And I remember my mother telling me something that I'll never forget, which is what I try and encourage everybody else to follow, which is nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I tried. And I wrote the essay, and I did the problem-solving skill question, and I wrote the poem, and I did the drawing. And next thing you know, I got accepted. So while I'm doing the architectural program, my love for sound was always very, very high. I was very passionate about sound and architecture. Now, why was that? Well, I grew up in a musical household. My father plays 4 instruments. My sister teaches piano. My brother plays the drums. My mother just got a crazy CD collection, so she listens to every type of music known to man. My grandfather, my aunts, everybody sings, everybody plays an instrument. So I always grew up with this love for music. Now, for me personally, I get excited about things when I feel like I'm doing something that's never been done before. And, or if it has been done, very rarely, I get excited about these things. So while everybody else in my class was busy working with windows and these sorts of things and walls, as was I had an acute sense for the sound. I love the sound. So the sound is what kind of got me hype. And I remember, facing a bit of criticism for this because, sound, who cares about that? But I always found that sound is it really helps to define a place. Sound is just as important as texture. It's just as important as color. I think sound is a texture. It is a color. It is a shape. It is a feeling. It is an emotion. It is a spirit. And it impacts architecture. And so I remember one day designing this one house. It was a media house. I think it was in my second year. And my media house, while all my other classmates were maybe creating these houses that capture Toronto visually, the CN Tower, I remember being on a very awkward site, Adelaide and John, if I'm correct, and I couldn't really capture all these things. So I decided to work with sound and pull the sound of the street in and push it back out. And I was working on my project late one night, And a teacher looked over my shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm working with sound." And I remember he shot me down. And he said, "You know, what do you know about sound?" You know what I'm saying? Like, what do you know about sound? This is ridiculous. And I really hurt, but I listened to him and I took my eraser and I erased everything. So I started designing these buildings like everybody else. And then the following day, another professor of mine, Adrian Blackwell, thank you, Adrian, by the way. Adrian looked over my shoulder and he said, "Sean, what happened to that really cool house? That, you know, what happened?" I said, "You know, that was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing." He said, No. He said, "The fact that you do hip hop, it makes you different. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because that makes you have a unique, that enables you to have a unique quality than your peers." And he said, "If there's a way that you can tap into your love of hip hop and your talent for hip hop and encompass that into your architecture, you will create a form of architecture that has never been done before." And that's what brings us right here to my 5th year architectural thesis project, soundSPACE. In my 5th year, I finally found a way to fuse everything that I know about architecture. See, all these years of me doing the architecture, I was still doing my hip hop performances. I was still working in a barbershop. I was still touring Canada with a rapper named Infinite at the time, DJing. I was producing for CBC Radio, doing various freelance documentaries, and these things never stopped. So when I got into my 5th year, I thought, aha, I want to create something that's based on what you hear instead of what you see. I'm going to let hip hop and my knowledge of hip hop guide it. And so essentially, what is the soundspace? Essentially, when I was creating this project, as I mentioned before, I wanted it to be based on sound. Now, I come from a musical background, and they've always had that saying that music is like the universal language. So since music is sound, and sound is a frequency, and frequency is a wavelength, if my architecture is dependent on these wavelengths, then theoretically, I should be able to create a universal form of architecture, right? Pretty deep. And so, essentially, I noticed that when I do my shows, one of the things that makes my shows work really well is when I'm holding the microphone, when I'm interacting with the crowd. So I found that interaction works really well. So, okay, I want my project, if I could tap into this interaction, my project would be on a whole other level. Now I notice what happens when you give somebody a microphone. They can be as timid as they want. You leave them there for maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and when you come back, they'll be because they're hearing themselves. So if my architecture could be dependent on these microphones and speakers, it heightens the level of interaction, which I think heightens the experience. So what I did essentially was create a column. Now these columns have 5 speakers and 5 microphones inside each one. And there'd be about approximately 3 meters apart. They'd be approximately 3 meters high. And they would just be a grid of them. I mean, if you could see the model here, I don't know if you can see that, but if you zoom in, all these little lit up, these little lights here represent columns. And I picked a location along the southern edge of Breadenier Pond, High Park. So if you could imagine yourself walking amongst these columns, and the only way that you can decipher where you are is by snapping, hello, and making these sounds. As you make these sounds, the microphones are picking you up, and they are playing your sounds back with either an echo, a reverb, or in some cases, a tone. Now, some of these columns will be activated, some of them will be turned on, and others will be turned off. And basically, I would create these perceptual rooms. Sometimes you might be standing between some columns, and you might hear the sound of a tone going dum 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 dum. Now, what's the purpose of this? The whole purpose essentially is I'm trying to recreate a room. I'm trying to recreate space without walls or ceilings, rather doing it outside. Now, what was interesting is when I was conducting these tests, I have a parrot, and as the parrot would chirp and the parrot would hear himself, he would get more excited and sound would be amplified, and this would become this experience. And this opened itself up to being more than just a human type experience. This was bigger, which coincides with my idea about the universal form of architecture. So essentially, we have a grid, and the possibilities are endless as to the different shapes and types of rooms. That's what these drawings are here. Actually, these are some of the different shapes and configurations. Now, there's literally an infinite number of possibilities. So what I did was I decided to create 4 different layouts, 4 different configurations for this site, in this architectural project, based on the 4 seasons. The first season was spring, of course. Then you have summer, then you have fall, then you have winter. Now what I did was I took each season and I broke them down into their characteristics, descriptions, colors, and based on these descriptions, that dictated the orientation of the space. If I can give you one example, spring, right? You have spring way down at the bottom, a little hard to see. But spring, when you think of spring, you think of flowers and things popping up randomly. So these spaces that are activated tend to be quite sparse. They seem to be popping up. So these colors here are not actually on the site. This would be invisible. All you would see on the site is the grid. These merely indicate what the spaces are. And then there's a number that goes along with it, 14, in case you hear the sounds of water trickling in there. So you have the sounds of things popping up that spring. Let's talk about fall. Fall, I think of leaves overlapping each other on the ground. I think of brown, yellows, and reds. I then translated brown, yellow, red, these colors into tones. And each tone is an octave up from the other. So certain spaces now, when you clap and snap your fingers, it will generate different tones. So the architectural project now begins to act almost like an instrument. And with each tone being an octave up from the other, as this thing begins to resonate and be activated, sometimes by the GO train passing, maybe it's by a car passing down the Queensway, maybe it's a streetcar, or people walking by, this thing begins to sort of become this experience. How do I take this project to the next level? Well, I'm proposing that if we could set up another one of these sound spaces in another part of the world, we could link them via the internet, and you could literally have somebody in Russia experiencing the same sounds as somebody in Toronto right here in Grenadier Pond High Park. And there could be this dialogue going back and forth. This is an architecture that's happening in real time that can change its form and change its shape by the click of a button. Now some may argue, well, that's not architecture. That's more like an installation. It's more like an experiment. It's more like maybe landscape architecture. It's more like an intervention. You're right. It is all of these things, and that to me is what I feel most proudest of with regard to my thesis. It challenged what we know about architecture and what we know about space, and at least got us really thinking about what that means. I remember when I was creating this project, I faced a lot of ridicule from certain classmates and thinking that it wasn't architecture. Even my own professor, I remember him telling me, Sean, you've come to a fork in the road. You have a great project. If you do what you want to do by putting this ambiguous grid across, I don't know what kind of grade you're going to get, but if you follow what I'm suggesting, which was to remove certain columns, hey, you'll get a good grade. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and I stuck to my vision, and I covered the site with these grids because I wanted it to be ambiguous. And I actually ended up receiving my very first A on this project, which I've never received an A in my life, ever. And this was my very first A. I was most proud of it. The project has since been displayed, aside from the initial exhibit, it's been displayed 2 more times after that for the Visions of Science science fair with Francis Jeffers right here at U of T in the medical building, where I was the keynote speaker, and I brought in the project. And here we are again, a 3rd time with the columns up for in the grand design exhibition. And it's truly an honor, and it makes me feel good to have stuck to a vision and know that one day this will be put up. Understand it, one day this is going to go up. Mark my words, I promise you, something this intriguing, this interactive has to be put up somewhere. And my goal is to use the hip hop and my name in hip hop and my networks and what I'm trying to do to get this thing realized. And the last thing I'll say, it doesn't get much sweeter than this, people. Let me grab this. It doesn't get much sweeter than this. Here we have, aside from the Superman right here, aside from that, if we can turn to page 14, if we can get a shot of that right there. Get a shot of that right there. can see that. That's me, people. That's me. That came out just today. I'm very proud of a project that I didn't know what would happen. I think it's advanced. I think it has a lot of potential. But even more than that, going back to my saying about nothing ventured, nothing gained, believing in yourself and anything is possible. And I just hope to see this up one day. SoundSPACE.